everyone. I'm delighted to see so many present for the lecture this evening, and a warm welcome to each and every one of you on behalf of the University of Edinburgh, and perhaps especially on behalf of the College of Humanities and Social Science. It's my great privilege to have the opportunity to introduce this evening's lecture, which is to celebrate the appointment of Professor Jake Ansell to the Chair of Risk Management at the university here in the Business School. Jake's background is a very interesting one, and I'd like to say to you a little bit about his experience before he came to the university in 1990. He was educated in mathematics, got a first-class degree at the University of Leicester. He then went on to do an MSc in statistics at the University of Newcastle upon Tyne. And he followed that by doing a PhD, which he completed at the University of Kiel. He's a very esteemed member and fellow of the Royal Statistical Society, and also recognized as a chartered statistician, also with the Royal Statistical Society. He taught in many institutions before we had the good luck to have him come to us here at Edinburgh. But he's worked with us since 1990 in operational research and statistics at the Department of the Business Studies, as it was then called, promoted to senior lecturer in operational research in 1995, and eventually appointed and recognized for his academic work to Professor of Risk Management in 2006. Jake has been a stalwart, both in the former faculty and in the college as it was to be created. A stalwart in giving up his time to academic administration. I won't mention each and every job that he's done because we would be here for a long time before the lecture got started. But a particular mention should be given, I believe, to his period of deanship of undergraduate studies for the College of Humanities and Social Science, a position he held between the years of 2006 to 2009. Before that, he'd acted as Associate Dean for Quality Assurance and Enhancement, also in the newly formed college. His research interests, I think, will become apparent to you this evening, and I will not say very much more about them, except to say that he's really tried to understand, I think, the way in which we think about this whole idea of risk and how our understanding gets developed about it. He's had particular highlights in his career, and again let me draw attention to one in particular, in which he read a paper to the Royal Statistical Society on practical methods in reliability data analysis. For many of us, coming from multiple traditions, this would not be for the faint-hearted. He's also been a publisher of books, where he's published again on the same theme of practical methods in the handling of data. He's also done a book, as you might expect, on the subject of risk, its assessment, methodologies for understanding it, and perhaps even more importantly, the management that may flow from that analysis. As if that isn't enough, there are multiple papers in recognized and esteemed journals, and when he's not doing that, he has an interest in folk music and in the arts. It therefore is, I think, an opportunity for all of us to hear what he has to say on tonight's subject. The title of his inaugural lecture is Myth and Risk, and I'm sure you join me in looking forward very much to this a chance to understand better a concept which is certainly in very popular use. So if you'll join me and to start the lecture, so thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Waterhouse, for such an introduction. Can everybody hear me? Good, great. This lecture started life back in 1995 at a conference on risk at Bradford, at the management school in Bradford. And two people have contributed to ideas and concepts around it. Peter Moles, who unfortunately is teaching today, and Alison Smart, who unfortunately can't be with us, from Aberdeen. So essentially, they have some claim to be part of this presentation. However, everything I say, all the mistakes I make and everything else is due to myself and not to either of those two individuals. I have a lot of thanks to offer. Firstly, thanks to all of you to turn up today to come and see this talk. I also want to thank two psychologists, the first of which is unknown to me. It was a psychologist who interviewed me at the age of 7 because my school decided that I was educationally subnormal, brackets mild, which is an interesting concept. Fortunately, that psychologist established in the school's mind that this may not be correct. And so I didn't finish my time in a special school. The other one, which I probably owe the chair to most distinctly, is Professor Vicky Bruce, who I enjoyed working, as Lorraine has already mentioned, under when she was head of college. I hope that my co-authors, I've managed to capture all my co-authors. I have a substantial number of co-authors, ranging over people who are actually in the room. There are several people actually here today, some of which I could mention, but I am not going to because it would be embarrassing to them. So we'll skip on. But I hope I've not missed anybody off. If anybody feels they've missed off, shout now. Nobody? Okay, we'll go on. I ought to say something about the context I work in. The first thing is to talk about the business school. We are delighted to have a new building. The new building is something which finally achieves something I've always hoped for. And the people sat in the third row are people who, and there is other people scattered around the room, are people who are very important to us. They are PhD students. We finally have managed to integrate PhD students and academic members of staff by the new building, and this must be commended as a major leap forward. The next group I have to talk about, I'm currently acting head of the marketing group, and I'm delighted to represent that group in many senses. They have a very strong tradition within the interpretive school of marketing, and so several of them have been contributing in the area of children, food, and the medical context. And one of my colleagues did a lot of work, well, I say on death, but she would say on bereavement. So that's one feature. We also have a quantitative group within the marketing group, which I am primarily a member of, on financial services marketing and services marketing, and also a colleague working in international and strategy. So we have a round group in marketing in the sense that we cover all the options. The other people that I have to speak about is a group which I also am associated with, which is the Management Science and Business Economics group. And this has the distinction of having both editors of the Journal of Operations Research actually in the group. It, of course, causes major problems for many of the rest of us because no longer can we submit to that journal, which is a great shame. But que sera, sera. I'm sure we'll find some way around it. It's got strengths in optimization, heuristics, and asset management. It also, because it has business economics, has a lot of work on mergers and acquisitions and governance of companies. So it's very interesting in that context. The final group, which is a major international research centre, is the Credit Research Centre, which I've been a member of for a number of years, and it's led by Jonathan Crook. It has one of the most famous conferences within the academic practitioners area in credit research. This is a biannual conference which attracts people from across the world and has a attendance somewhere in the region of 400 a year when it occurs. So that's a bit about the context in which I work. The next thing I want to talk about is the things which I'm not going to immediately dash into. I would be very happy to talk about reliability, but there's only one or two people in the audience who would be particularly interested in that. Co-authors. I could talk about asset management, and I'm very delighted to see Travis Poole here in some senses because we're working with people at Scottish Water in that context now. I'm not going to talk about credit research directly. I'm not going to talk about small and medium-sized enterprises, and I'm not going to talk directly about financial services. But I'm going to block my copybook with people from the financial community because I'm going to have the nerve to talk about the current financial crisis. So if they want to throw things at me, they can do subsequently. The first thing we are going to get is my brother, Raymond Ansell, and my nephew, Samuel Taylor, are going to play the Outlandish Night. This is Samuel's arrangement of the traditional version of this piece of work. My sister said they could spend ages tuning up, because that's what folk people do. They'll spend a lot of time ensuring. Everybody happy? Yeah. Good.
Shall says, turn your back unto me. For it's not fitting that any gentleman should see a naked lady. So she's lighted him up, his horse so high, she's turned unto she. She's catching him around, minnow so small, he's tumbled all down in the sea. Lie there, you false young man, lie there instead of me. For it's here you've killed 6 pretty maidens, and the 7th one hath killed thee.
Thank you. Why is that relevant? Why is the outlandish night an appropriate start to a lecture on myth and risk? It's a cautionary tale. It's a tale which has been communicated through folk song. There are, well, I've quoted 250. There's probably not 250. There's probably nearer to 500 versions of this folk song. So it has resonance across the whole of Northern Europe. And you start wondering why a song should have such resonance. It's a story about a strange knight whose aim is primarily to seduce a fair lady with money, in order to rob, debauch, murder. So it's obviously something telling somebody that they shouldn't do this, or it shouldn't be allowed to happen, and warning people. It's clearly a myth. We can't actually point to a historical event where this has occurred. People can go through the archives and try and find some events that may have suited this, but clearly it's mythical. It is sound advice, though, and it's a way of managing risk, giving people information which they then can use. Now, it shows how some of us are very sexist in our thinking, because clearly, to me, what it said is it's a warning to fair maidens. Don't mix with outlandish, strange individuals. But clearly, as Alison has pointed out, that it's a warning to outlandish knight. Don't mix it with the women, they'll get back. So I think we have to, decide who's going to get this advice. All right, I'm interested in risk, and the aspect of risk that one finishes up with is something where there is going to be harm. But it's not obvious that the harm is actually going to occur. There is a chance that it will occur. And harm can be anything from financial loss, injury, death, and various other aspects. But one of the great interests in risk management is the fact that the terms that we use are polymorphic, i.e. in different contexts they mean different things, and the words themselves have different meanings. Within the tradition I come from, within statistics, it's very clear that risk is purely uncertainty. However, if you talk to a sociologist, they'll go back to the Knightian view of risk and uncertainty, where risk is what statisticians deal with because it's quantifiable, whereas uncertainty is bits which you can't deal with by quantification. Now, of course, a lot of us would realise that that shows a very old perception of statistics, but clearly risk, quantifiable, they mean very much within the tradition of frequentism. However, uncertainty perhaps might be dealt with now because it's a subjective view in terms of the Bayesian framework. But one of the most important features that I've always thought about risk is that it's intangible. You cannot actually measure risk. Risk is not plausible within this context to be measured. What we measure is primarily the symptoms, the outcomes, not risk itself. There's something peculiar about this thing called risk. And whenever we try to measure it, we may not have measured it correctly. Okay, so I've said something about risk. I'm going to spend a lot longer talking about myth. Because myth is something which we all have an understanding about what a myth is. It's common parlance. Everybody has an understanding. And this rendition of myth is an interesting one. The pre-scientific, imaginative attempt to explain some phenomena, real or supposed, which excites curiosity of the myth maker. An effort to reach a feeling of satisfaction in place of uneasy bewilderment concerning phenomena. So that's an interesting rendition. The problem is, for me, it suggests that myths are part of the past, the backdrop to our world. We've now gone beyond that. But as we all know, myths still exist. The urban myth, all those stories that people apocryphally tell. And when you actually go into it, although not necessarily called myths, there are myths throughout engineering, there are risks throughout medicine, and there is, sadly, myths across science. We have to be careful that we don't assume that myths are something of the past. Essentially, you can start thinking about myths, and obviously it has a lot of associations, a lot of past forms. We can talk about fables, legends, etc. What we're talking about is a narrative form, stories that we make, that we then judge whether they're relevant or not, and we take views on. And there's a considerable literature, and I'm only going to touch on part of it, about sacred tales, providing rules for society. And that's primarily what we're talking about when I'm talking about myths. I'm talking about how we condition ourselves, how we construct ourselves in that context. That myths provide us some guides, tell us what to do. And essentially, a nice book on the myths of the Titanic by Howells gives us another rendition of what myths are. And it's, you know, we're not talking about things that are false. What we're talking about is social representation of complex relationships between history, reality, culture, imagination, and identity. So as you can see, what I'm talking about is that it's what we live in. It's our being. It's our position. Rather than having this view that myths aren't part of the modern world, I see that myths are. It's always a story. It's always produced in a story form. It's not produced in any other form in that context. It's often orally related. It's embedded within the cultural tradition, and that can be the cultural tradition of the organisation in which you live. Myths try to encapsulate practice, belief, and the natural phenomena. I wish I could say phenomenon. I just wish I could. It would make it a lot easier. Embodies belief, accepted uncritically by a group. Now, some of you might say that, you know, myths can't be accepted in such senses. It would not make any sense to do that. But I'm going to show some examples, hopefully. So, it supports what is currently happening. It facilitates what you're doing. It provides us with the tradition on which we're working in. It provides us with the ability to change that tradition. And there are examples of myths which allow us to do things which perhaps we shouldn't, and in some cases perhaps we should. The question is, what is it based on? Often it seems to be based without a factual context. It's a foundation which is rather strange in that sense. We don't actually have to have some actual evidence. And sometimes we do actually have evidence, and it's a question of what the status of the evidence, whether it's reasonable evidence or unreasonable evidence, as I will come later to say something about. In the modern context, one could try and describe myth as something that is a complex situation which you try to reduce to something which is easy to understand. So it is a complex situation. We don't necessarily have access to the information, and we require justification for some behaviour. So that essentially we can't say why we're doing it, but we've got this justification because it seems good. And it also provides an account of good behaviour, what we should be doing. All right. One should always give some examples. There is the well-believed comment that consumption of a small amount of red wine is actually good for you. Partly based on the fact that there are red wine districts in France and white wine districts in France. And for a long time, in the red wine districts of France, they classified heart attacks as sudden death, whereas in the white wine districts, they call them heart attacks, which is a good thing to get round the data. We could look at the medical context. There's a very famous story about a bacteria which causes ulcers, Helicobacter pylori, and it causes ulcers. But for a very long time, the Australian doctor who said this causes ulcers was denigrated, because essentially everybody said you cannot have bacteria existing in the horrendous context of the stomach. Therefore, he is wrong. Sadly, he was right, and 70% of all ulcers were caused by it. Some of these things I'm going to come back to. Long-term capital markets, some of you may remember the financial crisis several crises before. Long-term capital markets nearly hit the financial context very strongly. It was fortunately resolved by the pensioners of America, the people who provided the money to save us from that crisis, are pensioners across the States. It would have caused major problems. It's related to the first one. Derivatives are risky, because Marion Scholes and Robert Merton both decided to set up this firm, long-term capital markets, based on derivatives. You can hedge anything. And Marion Scholes once gave a talk in Edinburgh saying it didn't matter what you wanted to control in the financial markets, all you had to do was be able to hedge against something you understood. And you've got plain sailing. Unfortunately, it was based on some myths. It was based on the myths that you can't get into extreme situations, that things like countries don't default. But of course countries default. There are people in the room who know that countries default. One of the major crises within UK banking a long time ago, was caused by the default within South America of several countries. Enron, I hope a lot of you have managed to catch the play. It's an interesting play, but clearly it was an aspect which is worth considering. Kegworth, the Kegworth air crash. A plane flying suddenly developed an engine problem. An engine was on fire, but the cabin crew misunderstood because they had a perception of how the engine fed into the air conditioning. And they said, it can't be that engine, we'll switch off this engine. And they switched off an engine that was working, the result of deaths at Kegworth. The captain survived. It's one of the rare occasions where the aircrew actually survived the event. Sadly, not all the passengers survived. I'll come back to the financial crisis subsequently. All right. Within organisations, it is obvious that they have underlying values. This university has some very strong, staunch values. It makes assumptions. It makes assumptions that none of us in the community are going to accept bribes, and this is going to be a major feature into the future. It makes the assumptions that we have certain attitudes towards students, and it makes the assumption, and it puts these out in various ways. It puts it out through communications, through regulations, but also through behaviour and how it inculcates that behaviour and how we produce our buildings, etc., etc. So organisations have attitudes, beliefs, and these are developed into the symbolism of those and the myths of those organisations. There is a lot of literature about talking about myths, and I wanted to try and relate myths, risk, and behaviour, and this, just to prove that I'm from a business school, is the usual quadrant diagram. You always need to have a quadrant diagram if you're teaching, and so here what we're talking about is trying to get a map of myths, but in terms of what they actually impact on. And they impact on risk, and they have an effect on behaviour. So that we can be having myths that reinforce existing behaviour, but increase our exposure. And one of the ones which Enron, WorldCom, and to some extent possibly the financial crisis is that we need high returns. High returns need to be obtained. And by doing so, we of course are in dangerous position because we expose ourselves to more risk. We can take ones which maybe assist change. And they might increase exposure, and the typical examples of that are the comments that were running prior to long-term capital markets, and to a certain extent are still common, about the tiger economies. The tiger economies are going to be those economies which are worth investing in, we should put all our money in, etc., etc., and concepts that countries don't go bankrupt. And every so often we forget that they do, and we go in and we take that as a truth, and it increases our exposure to risk. We also have ones that reinforce existing behaviour but actually reduces our exposure. There are quite a lot of people within the banking industry who actually regard derivatives as risky. They have a view of the bank which is much more deposit, lend as a concept. And the general view about derivatives being risky is fairly sound. They become risky mainly because nobody ever looks carefully at the assumptions that are underpinning them, so that this advice is fairly good, that unless you actually do a lot of work, there are potential problems with derivatives and the complexity that one can get to in this context. We also have ones that assist change, that decrease exposure because they give us good patterns. And quite frequently, if you're making organisational change, it's very useful to have local heroes that will be the first producers of the model for the future, the champions of what we want to do. And they're hopefully leading us to some promised land, some ideal that we can actually have as an organisation to follow. All right. Another aspect is, as I said, this idea of reasonable and unreasonable evidence. And the problem is, we're not going to know which is which. There's myth is a feature that we have here, that it clouds knowing. And of course, it's also our reaction to this evidence base, this myth, is going to depend on the values, attitudes and beliefs that we hold. So somebody like me tends to be tremendously risk averse, but some people tend to be risk seeking. So the myth may help them, assist them to actually increase the exposure to risk, whereas I might be taking a very negative attitude and reducing the concept in this context. All right, so that's enough on background. Let's go through a few examples. And in terms of examples, I will start with the very beginning of my career. The very first bit of work I was doing in reliability was on coherent systems. Coherent systems are absolutely wonderful. I say this because it's logical, they're rational. The system performance will not improve if a component degrades. It seems very sensible. Nobody can argue with that. You wouldn't expect, you break something and the system improves. No. Such systems, in terms of logic, are constructed in terms of and or. And one can prove some very nice results. The first result there, we established that of these coherent systems, K out of N systems tend to be fairly optimal if you're making choices about designs. Absolutely wonderful. I got into actually counting the number of such systems, the coherent structures. And one of the earliest papers was this generalization of a pure maths problem, which was fortunately, in that paper we produced a conjecture which was later proved by two pure mathematicians. The only problem for me, of course, is most systems contain not logic, which means that the system is not coherent. And most systems have some element of not logic in, so that was a complete waste of time. You do something, you spend a lot of time and energy on it. One of the aspects of working in reliability is that you look at a lot of products, you look at a lot of items, and what you see there is that you go from decreasing failure rate to increasing failure rate. You can think of this as the human model. You go from infancy, which is very dangerous. Once you pass the age of 5, usually death comes from accidents, primarily. And then you slowly get older and older until you start wearing out. And several of us in the audience probably know that wearing out is a major feature. So, in product terms, you have a burn-in and a wear-out. And for a long time in my early career, people tended to think of this as the model for behavior of components. But how many products do you know are like humans? Very few. And particularly in this electronic age, they don't have those same behaviors of burn-ins and burn-outs. So essentially, this idea, you produce a myth, people build models on, and essentially they don't work. Not too long ago, we were approached by a company and were told they wanted to see the number of events over time. And they expected it to be monotonically increasing. And here's a nice curve of monotonically increasing. And so they wanted me to analyse the data in that context. So what I decided to do was ignore that simple advice and look at alternative models to allow for smoothing in the context and to base it on a data-driven approach. The aspect was very straightforward. That's what the data actually looks like. When you smooth it, you do various other statistical routines to it. It doesn't look very monotonic. It's not nicely curving upwards. And the reason is very straightforward. Surprisingly, maintenance works. Your cars are improved if they're going for service, etc., etc. You get some benefit of having taken some action, and it would be sad if you didn't. All right. This is where I commit professional suicide, but hopefully people will realise that it's me speaking, and I'm not speaking on behalf of the Centre for Credit Research, or the Credit Research Centre as it should be called. There are lots and lots of situations we can talk about the financial crisis. Lots and lots of myths that have been created. There's a myth of hindsight, that we could have managed it considerably better. There's a lot of people going around saying, well, I knew it was going to fail. Well, they weren't the only people who thought it was going to fail. I think Greenspan, a person who has received an honorary degree from this university, realised that there was a problem with too much debt. Perhaps a lot of us didn't realise that the problems of default started as early, well, the major problems of default started as early as 2004. And 2007 was just the culmination of a long series of sad events. One of the myths I've already referred to, this idea that high returns are required, and that means we have to have growth. We've got growth is good. We can need to have acquisition. Acquisition is good. Bigger we get, the better we are. And of course, we get bigger by acquisition, but we also get bigger in the financial context by getting greater market share, greater share of the wallet. And essentially we start hunting after things which are probably not that safe to touch. The famous situation that the Midland Bank found itself, which is now was swallowed up into HSBC. It's wonderful experience of acquiring a firm, a bank in America. But one of the things that I am sad that people have focused on in terms of market share is the attack on subprime. And you might think subprime is this area where people haven't quite made the cut-off point. They're not quite regarded as a safe bet. And you think, well, therefore, you shouldn't lend to them. But if banks don't lend to subprime, who actually do they borrow from? They borrow from the payday loan system. They borrow from the loan sharks. And that is not good for society. Those people are not the best. In some senses, one would welcome the banks returning to to considering subprime. Of course, they would have to do it with a degree of care. And banks, therefore, could be seen as providing a social good. For a long time, mortgages were seen as very safe because you tended not to lose money on mortgages. You didn't actually make a lot of money, particularly in the British competitive market, but you had all this belief that house prices don't fall. Not too long ago, I think it was 2006, but Jonathan can correct me, we had a talk from somebody from the Treasury who basically told us that all the borrowing was okay because we had got a lot of wealth tied up in housing. I don't think that person would like to repeat that seminar in this present context. I think it might be a bit dangerous for them. So, you know, that's a feature. But one of the other things is this concept of rating. Ratings reflect what? They reflect what happened in the past. They reflect some attitude of the rater. And I think one of the aspects that should really deserve considerable investigation is the rating behaviour of many of the standard companies doing this. Moody's, Fitch, etc., etc. Because they can be blamed for the crisis to a large extent. And they seem to have got off it freely. And they are still, Standard & Poor, making ratings about countries. Well, if you couldn't trust them and doing it on securitisation, why should we trust them somewhere else? I ask you. Of course, some banks made the mistake of thinking that the money market was always there sloshing around with money and that there wasn't a problem with liquidity. I actually attribute to some of the problems that were created by what I would regard as imperfect regulation. Actions by regulators which have unforeseen consequences. And I think Basel I and Basel II probably suffered from this. They focused a lot of activity within the banking industry on certain aspects, and they deflected attention from proper risk management. They summed it into you've got to comply with Basel I, then Basel II, and if you do that, in some senses you have complied with good risk management. And of course that leads you to a question about what is a reasonable level of capital adequacy. Because what Basel I, Basel II and Basel III does, it says banks will have this amount of money available in a liquid form that they can actually immediately release and solve all their problems. And we used to have 7%, and now we increase it a little bit more, and maybe it's 10%, 20%, 30%. We need capital adequacy. But would that be sufficient? I mean, what are we talking about? We're talking about an amount which would need to get the banks out of difficulty. And I'm not sure we can actually put a value on that because we don't know how they're going to get into that difficulty. And then you start asking yourself, well, if we did ask them to have 40% capital adequacy, what would that do to lending? Well, it would actually dry up lending, it would make lending very expensive, and we would actually not have an economy. We've got to be very careful. One of the things one might actually say is that perhaps shareholders should have been much more diligent. How many people are a shareholder in the banking system? And ask yourself, did you actively get involved with the risk management? I was a shareholder, I didn't take any action. So, you know, maybe I failed there. Stakeholders. Yeah, I mean, the government claims that it's doing something, but I'm not sure whether it's actually a stakeholder. And I think this sums up, it comes from the book, the Bible, about descriptions of Whitehall by Hennessy. And I think this describes the problems for governments. Governments actually think they can do something. And sadly, they can't. They think they can control situations. They think they can make adjustments. And that by them taking these controls and making these motions, they will actually have an effect. And the answer is possibly they don't. It's a warning to governments that they do things. And, of course, we can look at some of the things they do. It's almost become sloganizing. Bankers are bad. This is one of the slogans that goes around. And, I mean, we need banks. Within this economy, we actually do need banks. But we're creating new myths, too big to fail. You know, if you look through banking history, you can look at times when banks have failed, and some quite large banks have failed. I mean, I quoted the Midland Bank having failed, etc., etc. You can go, there's no problem. They will fail. So we can't say they're too big to fail. I think that would be a big mistake. It would be a major problem. Never again taxpayers bail out the banks. Well, can I tell you, that would be a suicidal policy, because as we've just seen, there was a need to bail out the banks. The taxpayer has bailed out the banks. I don't think we can take such silly statements as meaning a lot. A lot of conversations have been about casino banking and dividing it off from retail banking. But which bit of the banks failed in the recent crisis? Was it the ones that were looking at the securitization, or was it the ones that were making loans on properties, making loans to companies? Which one failed? Which half was the problematic one? And when you start thinking about divisions of banks, putting them into segments and saying we can protect this bit of the bank from that bit of the bank, I think it's very hard to say what we can do in that context. I don't think it's as simple as that, perhaps. I think we have to start thinking about what we can do which allows for the possibility of banks failing and how we might react in that context. You know, the number of financial crises that we have is fairly large. We should accept that these things can happen. We're fortunate there tends to be some time between them. They're not coming on a regular basis. You know, long-term capital markets, not a single person probably noticed that crisis. There was a lot about it, but in essence, this one, we're having slightly more effect on us. But essentially, does anybody really know where the next crisis is going to occur? And the answer is no, we don't. We can build our little walls and build our confidence that things will not fail, but it won't save us. The only thing that might potentially save us is my next statement. Because essentially, as far as I'm concerned, the only thing we can actually do in this world is actually ensure that we keep on checking for the myths that people create, the statements they make, which have little justification or small amounts of justification, and be willing to challenge those aspects. Now, the next thing I like to do is, of course, ask my brother and my nephew to sing the Herald of Free Enterprise. Some of you will recall the sad fate of the Herald of Free Enterprise as it left Zeebrugge with its bow doors open and sank with a considerable loss of life. One also has to think that the Herald of Free Enterprise was of a class of ship called ro-ros, and I've sailed on ro-ros quite frequently since the Herald of Free Enterprise, but ro-ros across the world have major problems. The number of ro-ros that fail is amazingly high. So, thank you. We should remember that risk can lead to harm.
Sun goes down now across the sea. We're homeward bound now and on the duty free. The harbour's quiet, the kids asleep, tired out from Europe on the cheap. There are no poor now, they all have cars. Parked down below now, took off their stars. Television, if not the sky, the ocean lives us, don't ask why. We feel the ships slip from the land. Glad our trip went just like we planned. See the lights across the shore, not the overworked nor the open door. The cruel dark sea, our lives go down. All night we drown. The oldest grow old, why we all grow young. With the blue murder stuck in our lungs. Ship we sail, the flag it flies. It is the herald of free enterprise. Ship we sail, the flag it flies. It is the herald of free enterprise. We can salvage our ship up from the bottom of the sea. Recycle pop stars, sing let's agree. Scrap the lorries, whitewash the company. They can make no more money. In each life lost, much love, much missed. All of our names on some passenger list. It's too late for making, you sink too fast. The profit comes first, and people's losses come last. And the ship we sail, and the flag it flies, it is the herald of free enterprise.
Thank you.
Well, I think you've all been very royally entertained. But Prof. Ansell is willing to take a few questions if you would like to raise them, and it is an opportunity to have some discussion. And so I would really open to the floor now to see whether anyone would like to raise a question. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Jake, for a very inspiring talk. I wonder if you could say, what's your favourite myth that actually encourages risk-taking?
That encourages risk-taking. Anybody who follows me across the road. The number of people who have made the mistake of following me, including my nephew who nearly got run over at the age of about 8 on Randall's Crescent because of my action. So don't follow me across the road.
Thank you very much indeed.
What do you think the next financial crisis will be?
It will not be like the ones we're planning for. It will be completely different. We've seen, as I said, we've seen them from long-term capital markets. We've seen them in terms of this countries don't fail, don't default. The problem is that anybody who wishes to hazard in that area should avoid thinking that it will be due to lending. It probably won't be due to securitization. It may be due to something which occurs due to terrorism. However, the one reassuring thing, I recently did a PhD by Das Gupta, an individual who works as a trader but was doing a PhD at King's in London. And it's quite clear that the Twin Towers, the 2 aeroplanes in the Twin Towers, was discounted fairly rapidly. The impact of that risk is... So if it's going to be terrorism, it will be some more major crisis than that. So it must be more widespread. IT failures could be potential for leading to such difficulties. People have too much belief necessarily in some systems because they have to believe in those systems, and that becomes a myth in itself. So, no, I'm not going to speculate. That's unfair. You're part of the performance.
I enjoyed that very much, Jake. 2 words you said that I didn't expect to hear was Helicobacter pylori. If I remember correctly, could you really come back to them?
Some of us, I mean, the feature is, it was just that how essentially you get a belief within a profession, a learned profession, that something can't happen. It won't happen. You suddenly actually have this amazing attachment to, that's not possible. You can't have bacteria living in those circumstances. It's like the bacteria who live in the ocean trenches. Nobody thought they existed. And they're very good at cleaning up. Very good environmentally in many senses, those things down in the trenches. But people start making statements about what can't happen. And then you get evidence that proves them totally wrong. And the doctors were wrong. And I think the doctor who actually self-medicated, to show. He first actually took the bacteria to make sure he got an ulcer, and then he produced the cure. He fortunately knew what the cure would be. You know.
My remarks more by way of a warning to beware of statisticians. My distinguished young brother did not tell me that there were in fact some 450 versions of the outlandish name. In actual fact, if you work this out as a statistician, since I only brought one version, it was very unlikely that I would have the correct version. So that's why I would say beware of statisticians.
Yes, thank you very much. At the back.
I'd be interested in where you see if you like, the role of dealing with risk residing within the organisation. I mean, sometimes people would say that a good strategic review should have the responsibility for debunking risks, almost playing the sort of devil's advocate role. Other people say that it's to some extent the tone set by the chief executive. Others say that a good finance director should be able to really drill down and debunk some of these things. But where would it reside within the organisation, and is there a role for strategic reviews?
Where do I think risk is appropriately managed? I think all members of a business, a community, should be responsible for the risks that they can manage. There's a lot of work on blame and deciding about what level of blame you should have in an organisation so that it's not unduly attached to an individual. But that also means that whilst you distribute this risk, then of course the chief executive should carry most of the risk, but it should go all the way through the organisation. In terms of strategic review, I think one constantly has to look at an organisation, decide about an organisation's capability to withstand risk. And, you know, it's I mean, I've worked with a number of banks during the period of Basel II compliance, and the focus on Basel II just became so large, and that was going to solve, in inverted commas, risk to a large extent. You know, it's where you get distraction. And strategic review should be one of the things that says, yeah, we need to think about it. Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much. Yes.
Jay, very good talk. Thank you very much for it. Just to follow on from your comments there and in your presentation around Basel, do you think that as we try and control the risks that surround us more, we become maybe more comfortable with our belief that we understand the world and what's going on? And as we become more comfortable, we become less vigilant. And therefore, do you think that maybe that the current trend towards more regulation may well in the long term be counterproductive?
I think I put a part of it saying the shareholder responsibility, the stakeholder responsibility. And I do think that the complacency that you're suggesting is something we can get very dangerously into. We can start believing that Basel IV will be the solution, and the idea of, you know, the new FSA, the PRA, will be the solution of protecting us. And, you know, we create these myths, and then we're not focusing on the fact that we should, as a whole organisation, look at what the potential risks are. And you know, I perceive there is no difficulty in looking at things like subprime. To me, it's social banking to a large extent. And I have a degree of commitment to social banking. But you have got to realise there's a risk there. You've got to realise there's a risk when you're actually lending to anybody. You know, I mean, it was Maxwell who came out and said, if you owe a bank $1 million, if you owe them, then you're in hock to them. If you owe them $1 billion, they're in hock to you. You know, it's a facile statement, but in some senses, it is a feature that we need to think about where we're going to. And over-regulation leads to imperfect regulation, leads to complacency and belief. And I think that was the danger with Basel II and Basel III. I think Donald had a question.
Please, you would ask, and then I have another one here before we finish. Yes. I've lost, I think, well, how about yourself? Thank you.
Just come back to the definition of risk. Everyone is equating risk with bad things. For me, that's just a time dimension. Maybe risk is good for societies and for disturbance to happen.
Well, I'm currently supervising a PhD student with my colleague Ansell Ibrahim, and the student is looking at hedging in Islamic banking. This is very, very controversial, a very interesting topic, but it does bring us back to the old Arabic view of risk. Sadly, we've been dominated by the Roman view of risk, which is downside and harm, as you said, I was guilty of. The Arabic view was risk was associated with trading. The camel train would come through your village. You would offer your goods to the merchant. The merchant would go off into the marketplace some distance away, and you hoped that they would return, and if they returned, they would bring you goods that you wanted. The Arabic view of risk was both upside and downside. And I think it, in some sense, is a better way of thinking about it, taking both. You don't have a truncated distribution, but it is true that that is a very sound way of thinking about risk. Because the only reason we actually take risk is so that we can get benefit. If we are not getting benefit, then why are we taking a risk? A gambler gambles because they think there's a potential for winning, but they also enjoy gambling. They enjoy the experience. The downside is, quite frequently, and certainly for my own case, you lose. And it's a shame.
We have time for one last question. Thank you very much.
Jake, do you think the increasing speed of communication through electronic mediums is a stabilising force or destabilising?
I think the rapidity of which we can spread myths. I mean, too big to fail is a myth which I think has been created. And it doesn't have much sense because every bank ultimately will be a company within our capitalist system. And that means in capitalism, companies can always fail. And to suddenly say there's a class that's too big to fail is a problem. What we've got to do is be able to cope when they do fail.
Thank you very much for the questions. It now is my great privilege to be able to offer 3 thank yous on this occasion. First, to thank Dr. Raymond Ansell and Mr. Samuel Taylor for their 2 performances. Firstly, of the Outlandish Night, and secondly, the Herald of Free Enterprise, certainly adding greatly to our appreciation of the subject and the topic. So perhaps you'll join me to thank you. Secondly, I would like to thank Jake Ansell for a very illuminating inaugural lecture which we've had the benefit of participating in. I think I particularly, Jake, have appreciated your exposition and exploration of the relationship between myth and risk. And the 2 performances that both began the lecture and ended it, I think provided a very good way of encapsulating this complex area that you are discussing. I think firstly the idea that the myth may be a cautionary tale, as was seen in the Outlandish Night, that it might tame chance, if you like, help us to see and to avoid risk on the one hand. And then the other idea and relationship and interpretation that you suggested both in your lecture itself and finally in the Herald of Free Enterprise song, the idea that myth may distort reality as context changes, and as a consequence of that, harm, sometimes catastrophic harm, might result. So it's been, I think, a very, very interesting exploration of something which is all about us all of the time, and I suspect for many of us is poorly understood. But we will not forget your parting words to us. Vigilance is required, and I think we will all exercise this in a way previously not seen. The last thank you that I would like to give, and we're then going to ask you to join me in thanking Jake Ansell for what he's done, is to you, the audience, and an appreciation for the excellent questions you've raised and the opportunity that that's given us to hear really Jake able to discuss and comment on areas of interest to all of us. And so I ask you to join with me before you have an opportunity. All that stands between you and a glass of wine at this moment happens to be me, and there's an opportunity to take a glass of wine and join an informal reception in the conference room at the David Hume Tower, which is only a short walk away. I'm sure those of us more familiar with the university will help to guide you there. And so with that, may I ask you to join me in that time-honored way to mark the award of the chair to Jake Ansell and to thank him for this most entertaining and stimulating lecture that we've had this evening. Thank you.
This production is copyright The University of Edinburgh.